This is Casey Glass for Worship Synths, and I'm here today with a quick MIDI intro on the Nord Stage 2. So, Nord Stage, very popular keyboard right now. I'm sorry I don't have in front of me the manual for the Nord Stage EX for any changes there, but most of you, if you're getting into the Nord, you're probably getting into the Stage 2. And the Stage 2 is a really great keyboard for people who are familiar with keyboards, for keyboards that have been doing this for a while. One of the things that people love is that all the controls are right out front. So if I get thrown into a situation, I can put something together really fast just using the controls out front. But one of the frustrating things is that it's put together a little bit differently. In other words, kind of the controls are a little bit different from the way a workstation's usually set up. And especially in this case, the MIDI implementation is a little bit different from the way things are usually set up. So we're going to go through that real quick. So in front of you, you're going to have the controls, which are right here in the center, the main system controls. And we're going to go ahead and pop over to the MIDI menu. So we're going to hold down the Shift key and hit MIDI. And so this is the MIDI menu for slot A, which is what we have selected right now. So first of all, MIDI control local on means that if you were to play the keys, the tone generator in the keyboard would play. So if you had the piano turned on and local is on, you hit the keys, you're going to play the piano that's turned on. If you turn local control off, the keyboard will send MIDI, but it won't play anything. The piano section will play if that MIDI is looped back to the synth, but if it's just local control off, there's no MIDI input to the board, nothing will play. Now, the real reason for doing this tutorial is because the different MIDI channels for the parts are kind of confusing, and people get kind of tore up about that. So let's look at a couple of things real quick. The global MIDI channel is the channel that all the keys and all the controls are sending all the time. So every knob sends MIDI, every key sends MIDI, and so if you want to capture all that, that's all going out in the global channel. You can change that. You can change it to any of the USB outputs, or you can actually change it to the built-in hardware MIDI output. So this is where you plug an actual MIDI cable in. So those are different, and that's important. Sometimes people plug in, and they're like, I'm not getting any sound out. Well, that's because the MIDI outputs are different depending on what you're doing. So you got to make sure you have the right kind of MIDI selected. The next thing is that slots can have MIDI output. So the global channel 1 will send every single thing. Slot MIDI output will send all the controls for anything we're doing in slot A. So if we have some other keyboard controlling slot B and we kind of pop over there and change some stuff, that doesn't go out on any channel assigned to MIDI slot A. Now, for confusion and to avoid having too much MIDI going on, it's probably best to leave that off. So unless you're doing something in particular that needs that, we're going to leave that off. Likewise, each section can have its own MIDI output and input. So let's say we were doing something with the organ, or we wanted to trigger the organ from something else in slot A. We could go ahead and turn that channel to, let's say, USB 3. So now if I had a second keyboard set to MIDI channel 3, and I was able to bring that in via USB, or actually let's say the actual hardware MIDI, MIDI 3. Now a second manual will trigger the MIDI, the organ mode on this layer slot A. And if I went over to slot B and set it the same, we'd be able to trigger the organ from either slot that was active. I'm going to leave that off. Likewise, same thing for piano, synth. We can trigger all those things from different MIDI channels if we want. If we're doing an organ dual manual keyboard mode, that has its own MIDI input, and that'd be 16. So that's different from just triggering the default organ module. In dual manual mode, it's the second preset. So every organ module has 2 presets active at a time, and so we would be working with that second manual on there. You can also set whether or not the controls will respond to control change messages from a host and whether or not they will send those control changes. If you don't really care, you're going to kind of dump a whole bunch of MIDI data into your host. If you don't need that stuff, I usually leave it on. Same thing for program change, on and off. We can send all the current control change values to the host. So let's say you're recording, you want to have the board set up exactly the way it is now. When you start that song every time, all the controls start at the same spot. Before you started the song, you would dump this. So in the 4 bars before the song, you would dump this, record that, and then as you play it back, it's going to reset to that point every time. You can also go ahead and dump the actual program as a sysx MIDI message, or the synth that's currently loaded in slot A as a sysx message. So these are other ways of archiving your settings. If we go over to slot B, we have all the same controls, only now we're in slot B. So slot B is like a whole independent board, and it runs separate. Okay, for convenience sake, we're usually going to leave the global channel the same on both slots. So right now that's A, that's B. You can see they're the same. All right, the next little thing we want to look at is the XTurn section. So we're going to hit Shift XTurn, and you can see kind of the MIDI settings. Again, we're in slot A right now. I just switched over from B. And so we have the mode is program. The channel that this XTurn slot is working on is channel 14 off of the regular MIDI port. So if I want to make this work over the USB, I need to turn it up here to 14, which is actually what I want. We can determine whether or not this channel will respond to volume changes from the host. I'd probably make that, well, we'll leave that alone. Whether or not it will respond to program changes. Bank select. So these are things that when you activate it, whether or not it will send these messages. Bank select, control change. You can set per patch. So right now we're working out of this empty patch I have going on here. Any control change numbers you want the knob for the XTurn section to use, and also likewise these bank select and program change messages we're talking about there per patch. The CC value to start with when we start the patch, whether or not to send data from the mod wheel and aftertouch, or the control pedal, or the swell pedal, and whether or not the MIDI volume output should respond to the normal volume curve of the keyboard or a different one, so you can have hard playing, soft playing. You can determine whether or not it should send all the values we set back here when you load the patch. Usually that would be on if you bothered to set all those other things. You can determine whether or not there should be other things sent on that channel, like if you have things coming in on that MIDI channel, also back out through that MIDI channel. Usually it kind of depends whether or not you want to do that. So let's say we were going to set up an external instrument to play from the Nord, and we wanted to just use the XTurn section to do that. So the first thing to do would be to make sure we knew which MIDI channel we were going to receive on. And so in this case, we're going to say we're going to receive on MIDI channel 1 on our external unit. So if that's what we're going to do in this patch here, 16.1, which I have as an empty program, we would probably want to go ahead and turn the global MIDI for both channels off, because the keyboard is sending on those channels all the time. And if we were to keep that global channel 1 on, we may end up sending MIDI out to the XTurn channel that we don't want to. And then we're going to go into the XTurn section, and we are going to go ahead and set this to, let's say we're using a laptop, so we'll set it to USB 1. And then we could determine whether or not we wanted it to, send data on program load. Let's say we want it to load program 96 to tell the module to start with a volume of 127. Let's say that we need some bank select messages, so we did that. That there is maybe some sort of effect that we can control on continuous controller 15, and that we want to start off with a value of 64 for that, and send all the data yes. And now if we go ahead and turn on the XTurn section, we're going to be able to go ahead and control that external unit over MIDI channel 1, assuming I set that to MIDI channel 1, did I? Yeah. So now we'll be able to control that unit over MIDI channel 1, and the other things we're doing on the keyboard will not get sent to that MIDI channel. So truly the XTurn section is going to control that external module. Well, that's a quick tour through the MIDI settings on Nord Stage 2. I hope that's helpful. And please hit me up in the comments if you have any questions. And thanks again. Thanks. And thanks again. It's Case Glass. Bye.